History class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of revivalism and reform in the mid-19th century. And in this lecture, we're going to move on to the early movement for women's rights and what is known as the Cult of True Womanhood. The political, economic, and cultural changes described in some of the previous lectures also made for changes on the home front as well, as the workplace and the home grew to be more and more separated, and in some cases women themselves began to move into the workplace. And so evolved a new ideology associated with womanhood and the domestic ideal, which scholars have come to refer to as the Cult of True Womanhood, which allowed for women to create an identity that was separate and distinct from the aggressive and competitive world of men in the industrial workplace. Under this ideal of the Cult of True Womanhood, women came to be identified with piety, motherhood, and passivity in the home. And this was primarily an urban phenomenon, as women in the countryside and within the agricultural realm saw their roles on the farm not change terribly much from what they had been. This new ideal, while also granting that women had greater control in the home, depicted them as doting mothers who cared for the children and loving wives who eased the stresses and burdens put upon their husbands. As a corollary development to this new domestic ideal, a movement against prostitution evolved at the same time. Clearly, prostitution was not in keeping with the moral order that the Cult of True Womanhood demanded. And so, in various cities across the country, anti-prostitution societies were established, whose members would at times go into brothels and try to reform or preach to the women at work there, or to shame and perhaps out the male clients who were visiting the brothels. Others embraced this opportunity to promote women's education about their reproductive rights and women's health, such as Mary Gove, who traveled across the country lecturing about women's rights and equality, and Paulina Wright, who created a stir by bringing with her to her lectures an anatomically correct female mannequin, which sometimes caused viewers to faint or run out of the room in shame. Other women advocated for adjustments to the typical women's clothing of that day, and at times during this period there were efforts for women to remove some of the heavy outer layers or some of the stiff corsets they were required to wear under their outfits. We'll see true revolutions in fashion in the aftermath of the Civil War, but there are some beginnings made during this antebellum era. Women in these various reform movements began to coalesce into a movement for women's rights themselves. As I've already described, women were active in the temperance movement, the crusade against prostitution, various other moral and reform movements, and most notably the abolitionist movement, which provided for them a sort of roadmap for activism. The fight against slavery also gave motivation to women because there were similarities in the cause. In the course of arguing that slaves were humans with equal rights who should have equal freedom and opportunities, women might naturally look at their own situation as another subordinate group in society and begin to make similar arguments about themselves. Two of the women who led this nascent women's rights movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. There should be two T's in Mott, so forgive me, I'm going to add another T. These two were partners in early efforts at trying to achieve equality for women. And they were sparked in 1840 when they both attended an anti-slavery conference in London. And at that conference, they were not allowed to speak to the other men, of course, who had gathered there, and had to sit behind a screen in a separate part of the room. And they returned from that conference just incensed at their treatment and determined to make changes. Stanton, in particular, was very well read and knowledgeable about the law. She was the daughter of a prominent lawyer and had essentially grown up reading law books in her father's office. She came to have a particular opposition to the law of that day that determined that men owned all the property that their wives might have entered a marriage with or anything else gained during the marriage. So essentially women lost all of their property and surrendered it. So that became a particular target of Stanton and others in the movement. And from 1837 to 1848, they fought for a law in New York that would allow women to retain their inherited property, which ultimately was adopted in 1848. That same year of 1848, about 300 women and men gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, for a convention to discuss women's rights and equality. Attendees at the convention ultimately adopted the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, which famously included the phrase that all men and women are created equal, obviously borrowing language from the Declaration of Independence. It also stated, "It is the duty of women of this country to secure themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise," and prompted a series of other meetings held in the years after. While an important landmark in the evolution of the women's rights movement, the Declaration of Sentiments was not widely adopted and didn't lead to immediate changes in the aftermath. Most of the country still opposed equal rights and voting rights for women, and many papers around the country mistakenly took the Declaration as an act of parody and mocked it in editorials and cartoons all around the country. So, as I've noted, the real noteworthy changes in the movement for women's rights were to come in the decades following the Civil War. But these early developments set important precedents and got women's rights into the national conversation, creating the opportunity for changes that would come later.